It was an ordinary afternoon in the city, the kind where the sunlight fell softly between tall buildings, scattering on the sidewalks in broken patches. The streets were alive, but in a quiet way, people walking to work. Students rushing with backpacks slung over their shoulders. An elderly man slowly feeding crumbs to a group of pigeons. And a few tourists glancing at their maps, trying to make sense of the narrow alleys. The air smelled faintly of coffee. The distant hum of cars created a steady rhythm that mixed with the occasional laughter of children playing nearby. Everything looked normal, nothing extraordinary. At least, that's what everyone thought. She walked down the street carrying a small bag over her shoulder. Her shoes were worn at the edges. Her coat was simple. And there was a quietness to her that made her almost invisible to those passing by. She didn't rush. She didn't push forward with any purpose other than to move steadily, step by step. People glanced at her briefly and then looked away, returning to their own lives. She was not dressed to draw attention, nor did she carry herself with any kind of forceful confidence. She seemed like someone who had become a shadow in the crowd. Someone who had grown accustomed to the world moving without noticing her. At the corner of a small square, she paused. There it was, piano, sitting in the open space near the edge of a cafe. It wasn't new. The black paint was chipped at the corners, and some of the keys had slightly yellowed with age. A few notes were missing here and there, but the instrument had a presence. It seemed almost like it had been waiting for someone to sit and awaken it. A small sign beside it read, "Play if you wish," but it was faded and barely legible. The piano had been there for months, maybe years, and yet most people ignored it. It was ordinary to them, just another object in the cityscape. But to her, it called like an old friend she had not seen in a long time. She hesitated at first, standing a few steps back staring at the keys. Her hands hovered slightly above them, trembling for reasons she didn't immediately understand. It wasn't fear, not really. It was more like remembering something you thought you had forgotten, a memory tucked away in the quiet corners of the mind. People walked by without noticing. Some paused for a second, curious about why she lingered, but most continued on their way. She was almost invisible to them, just another stranger blending into the crowd. Finally, she took a deep breath. There was a small smile on her face, the kind that comes when someone remembers something precious. She lowered herself onto the piano bench, and for a moment she simply sat there. She didn't rush into music. She didn't announce herself. She just let her fingers hover over the keys, letting the old familiar shapes and textures sink back into her memory. It was quiet, but not empty. Every small sound, the scrape of her shoes, the soft shuffle of her coat felt, magnified in that space, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then she began. It started with just one note, soft and deliberate. A simple note, nothing more, but it carried something unspoken. Something that made anyone listening pay attention, even without realizing why. She pressed another key, then another, and soon a simple tune began to form. It wasn't fast or flashy. It wasn't a song meant to impress or show off skill. It was something small, almost humble. But there was a subtle power in it, a quiet honesty. People passing by slowed down. A woman walking her dog paused mid-step, tilting her head to listen. A young man on his phone stopped scrolling, sensing something different in the air. Even the pigeons seemed to quiet down, cooing softly as though respecting the sound. She didn't know if anyone would stay. She didn't play to gather an audience. She played because it was part of her, because it had always been part of her, the way breathing or thinking was part of life. Each note was a memory, each chord a thought she couldn't put into words. She let her hands find their way across the worn keys, letting the music grow naturally from the quiet depths of her mind. It wasn't perfect. Some notes were uneven. Some keys protested slightly under her fingers, but it didn't matter. There was something honest in it, something raw that people could feel even if they couldn't explain it. A few people had begun to gather, almost unconsciously. Not everyone, just a handful, but it was enough to make the space feel different. A man leaned against a nearby lamppost, arms crossed, watching her play. He wasn't sure why he had stopped. He didn't know the woman, didn't know the song. but he felt a strange calm wash over him as the simple melody floated through the square. A child tugged at their mother's hand, pointing toward the piano. The mother glanced over, then smiled softly and let her child watch. The music was small, gentle, unassuming, but it had a pull of force you couldn't resist if you were within earshot. She didn't speak, and she didn't look up. She was lost in the sound, letting it carry her somewhere beyond the square. Beyond the people, beyond the ordinary rhythm of life. Memories flickered across her mind, childhood moments. Times she had sat at other pianos, times when music had been the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't force the past. She let it flow naturally into the present. The melody wove itself around the memories, soft and tender. As if she were telling a story to the world without saying a single word, the people around her began to feel it too. Not everyone understood why. Not everyone could name the feeling. But it was there, something pure, something almost magical in the simplicity. The square, once just a place people passed through, felt alive. The air seemed to shimmer slightly. Even the cafe windows reflected a certain warmth, as if the building itself leaned closer to listen. A breeze stirred, brushing against leaves and papers, and the music mingled with it naturally. It was like the city had paused, if only for a moment, to witness something quietly extraordinary. Time seemed to stretch. People who had been walking hurriedly earlier now lingered, enchanted by the unexpected gift of sound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were forgotten. Maps were set aside. The music didn't demand attention, it invited it, and the people who felt its pull responded without even thinking. There was a connection forming, invisible but undeniable, linking the pianist with everyone present. They didn't know her story, didn't know her name, didn't even know why they were captivated. All they knew was that they were witnessing a moment that felt delicate yet important and still. She played as if no one were watching. She didn't bow or smile at the audience forming around her. She didn't seek recognition. She only allowed herself to exist within the sound, letting it flow naturally, letting it grow slowly from one small note into another. The simplicity of it was almost deceptive. People thought it was just a tune, easy to ignore. But there was depth beneath it, a depth that touched something inside anyone paying attention. Something human, something familiar, something unspoken. The afternoon wore on, and yet no one moved. The city carried on around them, but this square had become a different place. It wasn't flashy or loud. It wasn't a concert hall or a stage with bright lights. It was just a corner with a simple piano and a woman who had chosen to sit down and play a tune. And that, in itself, was enough. Enough to make strangers stop, enough to make hearts soften, enough to make an ordinary day feel extraordinary. It was the beginning of something no one yet realized, something small but powerful. A moment that seemed ordinary to anyone passing by who didn't stop, yet it held the seed of a story that would grow far beyond the square, far beyond the city, and even far beyond the woman herself. That first note, that first simple tune, was more than music. It was the spark of something legendary, waiting patiently to unfold. The first few notes had been quiet, gentle, like a soft breeze brushing against someone's face. But as she continued, the melody began to change. It grew not in speed, but in presence. Each note became fuller, more deliberate, as if the piano itself had awakened under her hands. She didn't notice the crowd that had started forming around her. Only the music, only the feeling that the keys beneath her fingers were part of her, part of a story she hadn't yet told out loud. The people around her felt the shift, even if they didn't understand it at first. They simply knew that something in the air had changed. A man leaning against a lamppost had his arms crossed, but now they loosened. He tilted his head slightly, letting the sound settle over him like a weight lifting. A young mother held her child closer, the child's wide eyes following the movement of her hands on the piano. The child didn't understand music yet, not fully, but something in the rhythm, and the gentleness of the tune made them quiet, made them still. Even the pigeons that had been fluttering around earlier had settled, cooing softly as though they recognized the importance of the moment. The city continued to hum around them, but the small square had been transformed into something else's space that felt suspended. Like the rest of the world had melted away, she continued to play, her fingers moving naturally, almost as if the piano was speaking through her. Each note was carefully chosen, yet there was an effortless quality to it. People who had walked past earlier now lingered, slowly stopping to listen. Some didn't even know why they were stopping. The music pulled them in without warning. It was as though it had found a way to reach deep inside them, tapping into feelings they hadn't thought about in years. One woman, standing slightly to the side, felt her chest tighten. A tear rolled down her cheek without her noticing. She blinked and looked around, realizing she was not alone in this quiet emotional response. Others were experiencing it too, each in their own way. Some moved visibly, some internally, but all felt the unusual weight of beauty and emotion. The melody itself began to change. What had started as a simple tune now developed subtle layers. There were soft rises and gentle falls, moments of lightness followed by small pockets of intensity. It was no longer background music, no longer something you could ignore. Each note carried meaning, carrying stories that had never been spoken but were somehow understood. The woman didn't rush. She didn't look for applause or recognition. She simply let the music flow, letting it grow naturally, letting it evolve from one feeling into another. And the audience, small as it was at first, became a part of that growth, caught in a spell that was invisible yet undeniable. Some people began whispering to each other. "Do you feel that?" one asked. Another nodded, unable to find words, just a silent agreement. The music was connecting them in ways that didn't need explanations. A teenager with headphones around his neck had paused mid-step, staring in awe. He didn't know why he was mesmerized. He didn't know the woman. He didn't know her story. But he could feel the power of the music anyway. He had heard music before, plenty of music, but nothing like this. This was different. This felt real. This felt human. And it touched something inside him he hadn't realized was there. The woman's face was calm, almost serene. She didn't make dramatic gestures. There were no sweeping flourishes or exaggerated movements. Her power came from subtlety, from presence, from being fully immersed in the act of creating something honest. Her hands moved with care, and each note seemed to resonate with the space around her. Even those who had initially stopped for curiosity began to feel the weight of her performance. They were no longer observers. They had become witnesses to something intimate, something rare. The music spoke to them without a single word, bypassing their thoughts and going straight to their hearts. A man standing slightly behind the first few rows of listeners found himself holding his breath. He had come to the square for a quick break, planning to grab a coffee and continue his work. Instead, he was rooted in place, unable to move, listening. He didn't even realize it at first, but he was crying. Not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but tears were streaming quietly, falling without permission. The melody seemed to know exactly what he needed to hear, exactly what he needed to feel. And it wasn't sad, it wasn't painful, but it was healing in a way that startled him. Something about the music made him feel lighter. Even as it reached the parts of him he had long ignored, the young mother with the child continued to stand there, her child leaning against her. She noticed the expressions of other listeners, the subtle smiles, the tears, the silence. And it struck her how something so simple could create such a shared experience. People who didn't know each other were now bound together by a fleeting, invisible thread. She realized the music had a language of its own, a language that spoke without words, that connected strangers instantly, that bypassed the noise of life and went straight to the heart. The child squirmed slightly, trying to grab at the keys, and she laughed softly, realizing even the smallest observer could feel the pull of this moment. The man with the camera, who had been photographing the city for a few hours, was now pointing his lens toward her. He didn't want to break the spell with flash or movement. He simply wanted to capture something fleeting, something rare. He felt privileged, even though he barely knew her. He knew that in a few days, people might forget this square existed. People might pass by without noticing the piano. But for those who had stopped, for those who had listened, it would be a memory that lingered, a memory that couldn't be taken away. He clicked softly, careful not to disturb the music, careful not to distract the woman who was weaving her story one note at a time. It wasn't just the humans who were affected. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. The cars didn't speed by as loudly. The birds had calmed. Even the sunlight seemed softer, more forgiving, bathing the square in a gentle glow. The music was no longer just a melody. It was a presence, an invisible force that filled the air, touching everything within reach. The woman didn't intend it. She didn't try to control it. She simply let the piano speak, let her heart guide her hands. The world responded. People began to realize they had been listening longer than they had intended. The simple tune that had started as background noise had become something extraordinary. A few children wandered closer, drawn not by the promise of fun, but by the magnetic pull of the music. They sat on the steps near the piano, their eyes wide, not fully understanding, but fully feeling. An elderly man shuffled forward from the edge of the square, leaning heavily on his cane. His hand shook slightly as he clutched it, but he didn't stop. He simply listened. For him, it was a reminder of a time long ago. A memory he hadn't thought about in years, now resurfacing gently. Carried on the wings of sound, the woman played without interruption, letting the music grow organically. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't force patterns. Each chord, each note, was deliberate but effortless. The crowd had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet no one pushed forward or tried to dominate the space. There was respect, a shared understanding that this moment belonged to no one and everyone at once. The music acted as a bridge between strangers, weaving invisible threads that connected them to each other and to the pianist, in a way that was deeply human. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that beauty, in its purest form, could unite anyone, anywhere. At any time, by now, a few people had begun recording the performance on their phones, but even they did it with reverence. They didn't speak. They didn't interrupt. They simply wanted to hold on to the memory, to remember that they had witnessed something rare. The sound of the piano was the true focus, and everyone knew it. The rhythm, the melody, the gentle rise and fall, it was mesmerizing. People began to whisper softly to themselves, thoughts of astonishment and disbelief crossing their minds. They couldn't believe how someone could sit down in a public square, with no audience expected, no stage, no fanfare, and create something that felt so alive, so immediate, so powerful, and through it all, she remained humble, almost invisible in her own presence. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't look around to gauge reactions. She didn't need to. The music itself was her message, her communication. It said everything that words could not. Each note was a reflection of life itself, ordinary, fleeting, yet capable of touching hearts in ways unimaginable. People around her began to sense the depth, sensing that there was more to come, that the simple tune was just the beginning of something far greater than anyone could predict, by the end of what seemed like hours. But was only moments. The air in the square had shifted completely. The music had created a bubble of emotion, space where people were united not by familiarity or language, but by something deeper, something universal. Strangers had stopped, children had quieted, adults had paused. The woman at the piano had done nothing more than let her hands speak. It was a lesson in humility and power, in the simplicity of doing something meaningful without expecting anything in return. It was a moment of connection in a disconnected world, a gentle reminder that true beauty could be found in the smallest gestures, in the softest notes, and in the willingness to share a piece of yourself with others. The gentle notes that had been floating through the square began to change. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A single chord lingered a little longer than usual. A pause stretched between two notes, filled with quiet intention. The air seemed to thicken, not in a heavy way, but in a way that made every listener aware of the space, the sound, and the presence of the woman at the piano. Her hands moved with a new confidence now, as if she were discovering a part of herself she had kept hidden for years. The simple melody had grown into something richer, something with layers and emotion that touched everyone who was still listening. The first to notice were those who had stopped closest to her. The man leaning against the lamppost straightened, his eyes widening slightly as he felt the music deepen. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe as he tried to make sense of the sudden intensity. The mother holding her child clutched the baby closer, sensing that something important was unfolding. Even the teenagers who had been standing at the edges of the crowd now shuffled forward, drawn not by curiosity but by fascination. The melody had shifted from being background sound to a force that demanded attention. Her fingers danced across the keys with a fluidity that seemed effortless. It was not speed that made it remarkable, but control, precision, and emotion. Each note carried weight, yet each note felt natural. People around her began to notice subtleties in the music they had not heard before, small pauses that made the next chord hit harder, soft whispers in the melody that seemed to echo memories long forgotten. Some listeners had tears in their eyes. Others shed smiles that came almost involuntarily, as if they had stumbled upon a secret they were not meant to understand fully, yet understood completely. A man in a business suit, who had been on his phone moments before, now stood frozen, his tie loose and his briefcase forgotten at his side. He felt a lump in his throat as the piano seemed to speak directly to him. He couldn't name the feeling, couldn't explain it rationally, but it was powerful and unavoidable. He had never seen this woman before. He didn't know anything about her, and yet somehow her music had reached inside him and woken something he thought had been lost forever. The melody began to climb, slowly and deliberately. She was not rushing, but the music was building naturally, like a story unfolding one word at a time. The tune twisted in ways that were surprising yet satisfying. A few children sitting on the steps near the piano clutched each other, mesmerized by the change in tone. Even the pigeons, which had once been fluttering about, had gathered quietly at the edges of the square, their heads tilting as if listening. There was something in the shift of the music that held everyone's attention, making the world outside the square disappear. Some of the people who had stopped out of curiosity now whispered to each other, trying to put words to what they felt. "Do you hear that?" one asked softly. Another shook their head, eyes wide. I don't know. It's like it's alive." In a way, it truly was alive. The music was no longer just sound. It had taken on a presence, a personality, a heartbeat of its own. It seemed to carry intention, to hold the audience in a quiet spell. And the woman at the piano didn't flinch. She didn't notice the stares, the awe, or the tears. She was completely absorbed in the act of creating, letting the music grow and speak freely. Her hands moved faster now, but not recklessly. There was purpose in every motion, a quiet confidence that had been absent in the first gentle notes. The simple tune that had begun as a memory had transformed into a living story. Some notes were soft and tender, others were strong and commanding, almost as if she were sharing secrets she could not voice. The melody twisted and turned, rising and falling like waves, and the crowd responded without thinking. They were drawn in, swept along by the ebb and flow of the music, feeling each moment as it came, unable to stop themselves from feeling deeply. Even those who had initially been skeptical, who had paused only because of curiosity, now leaned closer. They were caught in a net of sound, helpless but willing. The woman's performance was no longer just music. It was communication. It spoke of loss and hope, of sorrow and joy, of moments that were too complicated for words alone. People began to feel their own memories surfacing. Some felt pain from old mistakes. Some felt the warmth of a memory long forgotten. And some felt the simple, profound beauty of being alive. The music had touched something universal, something that transcended age, background, or circumstance. A young man who had been walking by with headphones around his neck now sat cross-legged on the edge of the square. He had forgotten about his phone, forgotten about the plans he had made for the day. He simply let himself be absorbed. The rhythm of the piano matched the rhythm of his heart, yet it was not forced. It was gentle but insistent, coaxing the listener into stillness and attention. People who had been standing now shifted their weight, unable to resist leaning closer, wanting to feel every note. Wanting to be part of this unspoken connection, the woman's face remained calm, even as the music became more intricate. She didn't smile or frown. She didn't acknowledge the crowd. She didn't need to. The performance was not about them. It was about the music itself, and about her ability to let it flow from her heart. Her fingers flew across the keys, but there was no panic, no haste, no effort visible. Only control, only emotion, only a presence so profound that it made everyone around her feel as though they were standing in a sacred space. Some of the crowd had begun to record the moment quietly, but even they did not dare to break the spell. Phones were held gently, cameras trained softly, but no one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The city noise that had once intruded now seemed muted. It was as if the piano had created a bubble of calm and focus. A space removed from the ordinary world, where only the music and those who could feel it existed. People felt a shared awareness, quiet understanding that what was happening was rare and beautiful. An elderly man with a cane shuffled closer, moving slowly so as not to disrupt the energy of the square. His hands shook, but not from weakness. He was trembling with anticipation, with emotion, with a sense that something extraordinary was unfolding before his eyes. The music carried memories of his youth, of times when he had played or listened, of moments that had once felt significant and were now resurrected in a way that was gentle, patient, and powerful. He listened without interruption, every note reminding him that even ordinary things like a piano in a public square could carry extraordinary meaning. The melody began to weave between listeners, as if aware of the different experiences in the crowd. Some people felt joy, some felt sorrow, some felt the warmth of nostalgia, but all were affected. A young woman sitting on a bench closed her eyes, letting the music guide her thoughts, letting it wash over her worries and frustrations. She hadn't known this woman, hadn't even expected to hear music today, and yet the performance felt deeply personal. She felt seen in a way that surprised her, touched by something intangible yet unmistakable. The woman's music began to swell, not loudly, but with quiet intensity. There was a crescendo, subtle but undeniable, a layering of notes that drew the listeners further in. People leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift. Some had tears streaking their faces, others had lips parted in awe. The simple tune had become something far more complex and human. It was storytelling without words, a language that required no explanation, no translation, no permission. Each chord reached out like a hand, each pause was a breath, each flourish was a word unspoken. Even those who had stopped only for a moment before now found themselves unable to leave. The music held them in place, not forcefully, but with an irresistible pull. Strangers glanced at one another, sharing fleeting expressions of understanding and wonder. They were strangers in life, but companions in experience, connected by a melody that had begun quietly, simply, and now engulfed them in its depth. Some people reached instinctively for their hearts, feeling a swelling of emotion they had not anticipated, and all the while, the woman played as if the piano and her soul were one. Her fingers danced with confidence now, exploring chords she had long loved, but rarely played in public. The music seemed to take on a life of its own, flowing in directions she hadn't planned, carrying her forward even as it carried the audience with her. The soft and gentle tune of the past had blossomed into a full-bodied performance, surprising everyone in its complexity, in its humanity, in its honesty. There was power, but not the kind that demanded attention. The power was quiet, invisible, yet undeniable. It was the kind of power that made people feel, truly feel, that made them reflect, remember, and recognize the beauty in something as simple as a piano and a woman willing to play it. The crowd remained still, holding their breath in subtle unison. Each person felt connected to the woman, to the music, and to each other. No words were spoken. None were needed. The story she was telling with her hands on the keys was unfolding in real time, and everyone could understand it in their own way. There was wonder in the space, awe in the air, and an unspoken acknowledgement that what was happening here was extraordinary, and yet the woman did not notice. She was lost in the music, letting it carry her, letting it grow naturally. The simple tune had become a story, a bridge, a moment of connection in a world where such moments were rare. The square was no longer just a public space. It had become a sanctuary of sound, a place where hearts could open without fear, where strangers could feel unity, and where the power of simple human expression could be witnessed in its purest form. The music had grown in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a gentle, simple tune had transformed into a living, breathing story, and now, as the woman's fingers moved over the worn keys, the melody reached heights of emotion that seemed almost impossible. Each note carried weight, each pause held significance, and each chord resonated in the hearts of everyone present. It was as if the piano had become a mirror for every feeling, every memory, every quiet longing that people had kept hidden inside themselves. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. Her focus was complete, total, and unbroken. Her hands danced with precision and grace, moving effortlessly across the keyboard. The sounds that emerged were more than music. They were emotions made audible. They spoke of hope, of sorrow, of love lost and found, of struggles endured, and of joy rediscovered. People could feel it, and even those who didn't understand music could feel the honesty, the raw humanity pouring from the instrument. The mother with the small child had tears running down her cheeks. She held her child close, as if protecting them from something fragile, yet at the same time, allowing them to witness the beauty of the moment. She realized that what was happening was larger than herself, larger than anyone in the square, larger than the city that hummed quietly around them. She wasn't just watching a woman play the piano. She was witnessing something extraordinary, something that could not be repeated, something that might never be forgotten. A young man who had been leaning against the edge of the square suddenly felt a wave of emotion he couldn't contain. His chest tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to stop a tear from falling. The music reached parts of him he hadn't touched in years, the memory of his childhood home, the soft laughter of a family he had left behind, the quiet moments when he had been truly happy and hadn't noticed it. All of it came rushing back through the simple, complex, perfect notes that the woman played. Even the elderly man with the cane, who had shuffling steps and hands that trembled slightly, seemed transformed. He listened with rapt attention, remembering a lifetime of experiences that had brought him to this very moment. He could feel the triumphs, the losses, the quiet victories, and the long-forgotten joys embedded in each chord. The music was speaking directly to him, yet it was not just for him. It was for everyone present. A universal language that bypassed words and went straight to the heart. The crowd had grown, not by force but naturally. People who had walked by without noticing now lingered, drawn in by the invisible pull of sound. Each listener had their own reaction, yet all shared a sense of awe. Some wept quietly, others smiled, and a few even laughed softly, overcome by the sheer beauty of what they were experiencing. There was no pressure to react, no social expectation. No judgment, just raw human emotion. Shared silently between strangers, the music itself began to rise and fall in a way that felt almost like breathing. There were moments of softness, delicate and tender, where a single note could silence the entire square. Then, without warning, a chord would swell, deep and resonant, filling the space with warmth and intensity. It was as though the piano were alive, responding to her emotions, responding to the crowd, responding to the world itself. People felt it in their chests, a vibration that could not be ignored. The square was no longer just a location, it had become a vessel for something timeless, a place where ordinary people could witness extraordinary beauty. A teenager at the edge of the crowd, who had been skeptical at first, now sat cross-legged on the ground, captivated. He could not explain why he was so moved. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, didn't even know her name. Yet the music had reached him in ways nothing else had, touching the core of who he was. He felt a stirring of emotion he hadn't realized existed, longings, regrets, hopes, and dreams all mixed together. Alive in the sound that poured from the piano, the woman's hands moved faster now, but with absolute control. The music became intricate, weaving patterns of melody and harmony that were breathtaking in their subtlety. Every note felt intentional, yet effortless. The rhythm and timing, the way she allowed some notes to linger while others rushed forward, created a tapestry of sound that held every listener spellbound. She didn't rush toward an ending. There was no hurry, no desire for applause, no concern for recognition. This was about the music itself, about the story she was telling without words, and about the connection she was forging with everyone who stopped to listen. The soft hum of the city faded into the background. The distant sounds of cars, footsteps, and conversations no longer mattered. All that existed was the piano, the woman, and the people who had paused their lives to listen. Time itself seemed suspended. Moments stretched, yet passed in an instant. The music was timeless, and the audience felt it. They felt it deeply, and in that feeling they understood something important, that beauty could exist anywhere, that human expression could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, that one person could touch countless hearts with something as simple as a melody. Few people reached instinctively for their hearts, feeling their emotions swell in ways they had not expected. Some cried openly now, no longer able to contain themselves. Others simply stood in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the power of what they were hearing. The music was personal and universal at the same time, speaking to each listener in a language they understood intuitively yet could not explain. It was the purest form of communication, beyond words, beyond gestures, beyond anything tangible. The mother with the child noticed other parents around her, watching the same scene, sharing similar reactions. She realized that this moment had transcended individuality. Strangers were united in awe, connected in a web of emotion, spun entirely from the notes that fell from the piano. She smiled softly through her tears, recognizing that sometimes the smallest gestures, a few notes, a simple tune could create ripples far larger than anyone imagined. Even the man who had come with the intention of a quick break found himself changed. He had expected nothing, yet he had discovered something profound. The music was touching parts of him that had been dormant, awakening empathy, kindness, and wonder. He looked around at the crowd and realized they were all feeling it too, each in their own way. The performance was no longer about the woman alone. It was about the shared human experience, about how one person could reach so many hearts with authenticity, passion, and vulnerability. Her playing grew more expressive, more deliberate. The melody flowed like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes rushing, always carrying emotion. The highs and lows of the tune mirrored the highs and lows of life itself, and everyone in the square felt it in their bones. The music was unpretentious yet profound, delicate yet commanding. It did not ask for attention. It earned it. And in earning it, it reminded every listener of the beauty that existed in small, overlooked moments. A few people had begun recording on their phones. But even they were careful, aware that any disruption could break the spell. They weren't capturing video for social media or attention. They were capturing memory, preserving a moment that felt too powerful to forget. Each chord struck a chord within them, echoing long after the notes faded. Some whispered quietly to those nearby, sharing their awe, their disbelief, their gratitude for witnessing something so rare. The woman played as if she were sharing her soul. There was no performance in the conventional sense, no intention of impressing anyone, no desire for applause, but every note was delivered with honesty, with care, with purpose. People felt it deeply. They could see it in her posture, in the way her hands glided over the keys, in the calm determination that radiated from her. She was fully present, fully human, and fully connected to the music. And in turn, she connected everyone around her to that same humanity. The crescendo built slowly, not forcefully, but with inevitability. The music rose and fell, lifting and carrying the crowd along a journey they hadn't expected. The melodies seemed to tell stories they didn't even realize they needed to hear. Stories of love, loss, resilience, and hope. Some listeners were crying openly now. Others were holding back, overwhelmed by the intensity of the emotions. But everyone, without exception, was touched. They were part of something larger than themselves, something that transcended the ordinary, something truly legendary in its impact. And yet, through it all, she remained humble, almost invisible. She did not glance up, did not seek approval, did not acknowledge the awe around her. Her only concern was the music, the story she was telling through each key, each pause, each gentle crescendo. The crowd, sensing this authenticity, responded in kind, allowing themselves to be fully present, fully vulnerable, fully human in a moment that felt sacred. By the time the final notes approached, there was a shared awareness in the square. Something monumental had happened. Something beautiful. Something unforgettable. The music had not just been heard, it had been felt, lived, and remembered. Strangers were bound together in silence, connected in awe, connected in gratitude, connected in something beyond explanation. And the woman at the piano, completely immersed in the last chords, had created a moment that would linger in the hearts of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The final notes lingered in the air, soft and trembling, like a breath being held and slowly released. The woman's hands rested lightly on the keys, as if afraid to break the spell she had created. The square, once filled with movement, with ordinary sounds of life, now seemed to exist in suspended time. People stood frozen, not out of fear, but out of reverence, each caught in a fragile, delicate bubble of awe. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved, and even the city seemed to pause, holding its breath with them. Then gradually, the silence began to crack. A soft clap, hesitant at first, broke through the quiet. One by one, people began to react. The small applause grew, not into chaotic noise, but into a respectful, heartfelt recognition of what had occurred. It was not just appreciation for skill, but acknowledgement of something deeper, something rare and beautiful that could not be forced or recreated. People's expressions were a mixture of wonder, disbelief, and joy. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others had their mouths slightly open, unsure whether to speak or stay silent.